1873 Fragmentation of Mka Maori land ownership. The Native Land Act 1873 allowed the Native Land Court to fragment land ownership among Maori. Instead of having 10 names listed as owners, and the rest of the tribal group missing out, everyone with an ownership interest was now to be put on the title. Conceived as a way of recognizing tribal ownership, it did not individualize land ownership but fragmented it. Individual Maori were not given blocks large enough to support themselves in the way Pke farmers could, but instead they received shares in blocks that were then partitioned and repartitioned into uneconomic segments at great time and expense, especially given the cost of surveyors and lawyers. This, and the ordinary costs of living, pressured many into selling their interests. Although intended to slow land selling, purchasers, both crown and private, resorted to secretive methods such as paying advances to numerous individuals, sometimes for years, before appearing before the court and claiming the percentage of the block corresponding to their proportion of the shares. The effect upon Maori was disastrous. This fragmentation has bedeviled Mandori land ownership ever since, making it extremely difficult to borrow development funding, or utilize much more freehold land productively. A repudiation movement at this time, driven by a resurgence in Renanga, council, or tribal management, aimed to repudiate or obtain compensation for bad land deals. 1877 Treaty of Waitangi judged legal nullity at its lowest point. The Treaty of Waitangi was described by Chief Justice James Prendergast in the Waiparata v. Bishop of Wellington case as worthless, having been signed between a civilized nation and a group of savages. This extreme view denied that the treaty had any judicial or constitutional role in government, because Maori were not a nation capable of signing a treaty. Since it had not been incorporated into domestic law, it was a legal nullity. Although many of his conclusions were overturned by the Privy Council by the beginning of the 20th century, his attitude largely prevailed from the 1870s to the 1970s. 1879 Major meetings on the treaty. A resurgence of big treaty meetings, at Kohamrama, or K, in 1879 and Titai, Waitangi in 1881, and at various centers on the east and west coasts, brought the treaty back into prominence. Over 3,000 people attended the Titai meeting, at which a monument to the treaty was dedicated at Titai Mary, and demands for a Maori parliament were put to the government. 1881 Peruaka occupied by force. After 2 years of tension and Maori non-violent resistance to land alienation in southern Taranaki, the government occupied the town of Peruaka by force. From 1879, the prophet T.Y.D.O. Rangamai had encouraged his followers to uproot survey pegs, and plow up roads and fences erected on land they still considered to be theirs, thus asserting that they did not recognize the Taranaki confiscation. These plowmen were arrested and detained without trial. As road-making advanced up the Waimate Plain, often across Maori settlements and cultivations, Maori erected fences across the routes and more were arrested. Still T.Y.D. resisted settlement, so the government sent a large armed force into Peruaka on 5 to 8 November 1881, commanded by Native Minister John Bryce. Although there was no resistance at all, he read the Riot Act, imprisoned T.Y.D. and fellow prophet Tohu, and dispersed his followers. At T.Y.D.'s trial for sedition, even officials had to admit that the 10,125 hectares reserved for Maori had never been properly set aside for them to occupy and plant. T-Whirl and Tohu were exiled to the South Island to serve their prison sentences. Peruaka has been a symbol of Maori resistance ever since. 1882 King Tauyao makes peace. End of the New Zealand Wars. A formal act of peace was made by the King movement in 1882, when King Tauyao appeared before resident magistrate Major William Mayer at Alexandra, now Piranga. His appearance was seen as a conciliatory gesture of reconciliation between Maori and Paka. 1882 Mka Maori deputations to the Queen. The first of several deputations was sent to England to seek redress from the Crown. Maori felt they had a special relationship with their treaty partner, Queen Victoria, in person, but in this and each subsequent case taken to England they were referred back to the New Zealand government on the ground that the imperial government no longer had the responsibility for such matters. 1891 investigation of Maori land. A Royal Commission investigated the state of the laws controlling the administration of Maori land. It found that the situation could hardly have been more unworkable had governments over the years deliberately tried to make it so. Fragmentation of ownership and the complex and contradictory nature of the laws meant that almost nothing could be done. By now, only 50 years after the treaty's signing, Maori had virtually no land in the South Island, and less than 40% of the North Island. What they did still have was largely of poor quality and hard to develop, the areas that the settlers had not wanted. The Commission made many recommendations to improve the situation, but few were implemented, largely because they were inconsistent with government policy. 1892 establishment of Maori parliaments. Frustrated at the lack of success in securing a remedy for their grievances, Maori in different parts of the country convened large meetings which were called parliaments. Following meetings at Waitangi and Orkney, a Maori Congress or parliament, called Katahatanga Unity, met for the first time at Waipawa and Hawke's Bay. This Katahatanga then moved to several other locations, and developed a more permanent base at Pwai, Greytown. The King movement's own parliament was called Kahanganui. Both aimed to unify Maori, but neither wholly succeeded. Maori MPs such as Waipir and Hone Gapua drafted bills, and introduced them to Parliament in Wellington, seeking recognition of the Katahatanga. They were not successful, but in 1900 Carroll and Gada persuaded the Liberal government of Richard Seddon to set up a system of regional and local Maori councils. The councils had some success in dealing with matters such as health and alcohol sales, and in slowing the sale of land. But from 1905 their powers began to be weakened again when the Reform government, which took office in 1911, resumed a vigorous program of land purchase. The Katahatanga faded rapidly after the turn of the century. 1916 Ruakanana arrested at about the time of T. Whitey's death at Peruhaka. Another community sprang up at Mangapahadu in the Urueras comprising Iloers of the Toho prophet Ruakanana. As a result of Rua's alleged pro-German sympathies, he had discouraged recruitment for the First World War, and his sale of alcohol without a permit. A large expedition, commanded by the Commissioner of Police himself, made its way into the Urueras to Mangapahadu. In the grievously bungled raid that followed there was a shootout in which Rua's son died, and the prophet was arrested. Justice Chapman, in an excessive statement perhaps fueled by war hysteria, firmly expressed society's displeasure with dissidents at Rua's trial for sedition, saying his 18-month sentence is the lesson your people should learn from this trial. Some historians claim that the last instance of armed Maori resistance occurred at Maungap 6 Hadu, because Rua's people were armed, and resisted when the police tried to arrest their leadership. However, another view disputes this, noting that Rua had planned to meet the police with food and peaceful dialogue, and argues that Rua was no doubt determined to apply the laws of his own Takanga custom within his territory. 1918 Ratana movement. In 1918, as the following of its leader T.W. Ratana grew, the Ratana religious movement opened an office near Wanganui. The Ratana movement picked up aspects of the defiant spirit of the Peruhaka community, but softened its separatist stance, and had a strong focus on largely Christian religion and dealing. Its leaders also had economic and modernizing goals. In the 1920s, Ratana formed a political arm, and from the mid-1930s it entered into an alliance with the Labour Party in an arrangement whereby Labour nominated Ratana leaders as its candidates in the Maori electorates. By 1943, Ratana/Labour candidates had won all 4 Maori seats, thus gaining a much stronger voice in governing circles. The new members also brought into the Labour caucus the long-standing Ratana demand that the treaty be ratified.